Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Petrarch Institute's new session in our series on Western civilization. I'm here with my friend and co-founder, Dr. Miles Smith. You want to say hello, Miles?
Hello, everyone. We're delighted to have you here with us today. You're joining us midstream in a series of video installments on the golden ages of Western civilization. We looked at the roots of all of that earlier in a number of videos on the axial age. We've also looked at the golden ages of Greece and Rome. Most recently, we looked at the golden period of Rome, just to say especially the boundary between the late Republic and the early Empire. Alex, I think you're going to take us today into the early history of Europe. Did you want to quickly tell people what Petrarch Institute is and what kind of courses we have on offer?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, basically what I found in my life is that I've met many people who find the humanities and the classical tradition of the liberal arts extraordinarily interesting and wish that they had spent more time in their lives learning that, but because of, the pressures of life and need to earn a living, raising family, things like that, just didn't have the time. But I mean, my idea is that in our online age, it is possible through things like the Petrarch Institute to set up online courses, and I have years of experience in online coursework, where people can, at their own time and at their own schedule, have access to the wisdom of the centuries. So I think that in a nutshell is what the Petrarch Institute is trying to do. And you can go onto our website and look at information on our courses. We've had courses on the classical virtues, in focusing on Plato and Aristotle. We have a course running now on Nietzsche and Socrates and their conflicting notions of the good and ethics. And we're always thinking and brainstorming about new courses that may be of interest to our students. So I think that pretty well covers it. Do you have any other thoughts, Miles?
No, that's terrific. If people want to look at the courses on offer, including the current course on Nietzsche and Socrates, the email address will be posted on this video. Today, my understanding, Alex, is that you want to take us on a tour through what some people call either the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages, although I guess both of those could be, in a sense, misnomers. They would have been maybe strange names for the people who lived in that time. I heard it argued recently that the Dark Ages aren't really dark at all. They're brilliant in a sense. They give off a great deal of light, but for us in the modern imagination, the modern consciousness, they're out of sight and out of mind. So they're thought of or seen as dark. And maybe you can correct that perception a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, at first it's interesting to point out why that idea came about, this notion of the Dark Ages, right? Nobody in the Middle Ages thought of themselves as living in a Middle Age, right? So really this came about because of three movements, and like I said, we can basically say that the Middle Ages have been pretty hard hit for the last 5 centuries, right? I mean, in the English vernacular, the term medieval is often a term of abuse, right? The conditions were medieval. You'll hear this kind of phraseology come up a lot, right? Or someone's ideas are medieval. It means sort of backward, primitive, and cruel, or something like that. Certainly, often not something positive. The reason for this has a lot to do with the historiography that's connected with 3 movements which have defined the modern era, and those are the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. And all 3 of those, for very different reasons, all had motives to look upon the Middle Ages askance, right? So for the Renaissance, and remember the Renaissance begins in Italy, they look upon the Roman Empire as this era of glory, right? Not only in political terms, but in terms of literary and aesthetic standards, right? And the Middle Ages is a period of barbarization, right? So that is one approach, and therefore they were the first ones to conceive of there being a Middle Age in between their own time, when the classical antiquity was being revived, and the ancient period. The medievals themselves didn't see that sharp break. Then comes the Reformation, which of course broke from the Catholic Church. And of course, one of the things that's definitive of the Middle Ages is that Europe was a Catholic civilization, right? The art, the philosophy, the educational, legal, political, and economic institutions, all of them were centered around Catholicism. And of course, Protestantism, breaking away from the Catholic world, was going to, initially at least, look somewhat negatively on this 1,000 years of Catholic culture in Europe. And then the Enlightenment tended to look negatively not merely on Catholicism, but on Christianity, especially in the secular phase of the Enlightenment, in the French Enlightenment of the 18th century, where they saw their own time, well, as enlightened by science and technology and education, and therefore they tended to look upon this period of what they saw as clerical tyranny, holding back the tide of progress, a period of superstition and intolerance, right, which was a foil for their own age, right? In order to have an illumined age, an enlightened age, you need dark ages, logically enough, right? And you can imagine that the centuries of negativity toward the Middle Ages have their effect as well in popular consciousness. And the trouble with these is not that they're not, again, not facts and events that can be referred to during this 1,000-year period, which had a lot of complexity in it, but that there's a partiality to their perspective. And I think now in our time, many scholars are beginning to look at the period with some greater objectivity. However, one thing I think the critics, we will have to concede to the critics, is that the fall of the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages are conventionally dated to the year 476, which was the fall of the last Western Roman Empire. That's considered the symbolic beginning, let's say, of the Middle Ages. That process of collapse, which had been going on for a long period, was almost indubitably the greatest crisis Western civilization has experienced, right? As Sir Kenneth Clark, the British art historian, said, we survived by the skin of our teeth, right? There was a thorough growing collapse of culture, and in that sense, what we have to look at, I mean, I titled this "Lights in the Darkness." What we have to look at is the heroism of those who allowed Western civilization not only to survive but also ultimately to flourish. And my image is, if you look at those who had succeeded to the former Roman Empire, you had the Byzantines in the east, and then you had the Islamic civilization, which developed in the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa up to Spain, and then you had the West European civilization. Nobody who was wandering in the world in the year 700 and looking at the relative level of sophistication of these three would predict an auspicious future for the West European culture. And yet, remarkably, that's exactly what happened, almost miraculously. And so the story of what Christopher Dawson called the making of Europe, which takes place during this early medieval period, is, I think, a story of heroism, struggling against odds, and remarkable figures who made that possible. And in that sense, I think it's a very interesting era. Do you have any thoughts, Miles?
No, I think that takes to a very clearly drawn transition moment. In the last video, which like all the others is still available on our YouTube channel for people to peruse, we looked at the golden age of Rome, and at the threshold between the late Republic and the early Empire, you see a sort of consolidation of strength in culture and philosophy up to a point, and certainly in political institutions that have been carefully developed, and in legal institutions and legal practices, and then those were wedded to very well planned, very well sustained imperial ambition. Obviously, that empire did not last forever. So, Alex, you're taking us from the point when that edifice is crumbling and bits of it are preserved while new seeds are being sowed in a kind of barbaric environment. Is that a fair start?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The first thing you have to look at, referring back to the Golden Age period, the apex of the Roman Empire, was what the Pax Romana, right? The system of order and Roman law and Roman roads meant for something as basic as trade and commerce, right? This was a quote from Henry Moss that I thought was instructive. Along these roads passed an ever-increasing traffic, not only of troops and officials, but of traders, merchandise, and even tourists. An interchange of goods between the various provinces rapidly developed, which soon reached a scale unprecedented in previous history, and not repeated until a few centuries later. Metals mined in the uplands of Western Europe, hides, fleeces, and livestock from the pastoral districts of Britain, Spain, and the shores of the Black Sea. Wine and oil from Provence and Aquitaine, timber, pitch, and wax from South Russia and northern Anatolia, dried fruits from Syria, marble from the Aegean coast, and most of all, grain from the wheat-growing districts of North Africa, Egypt, and the Danube Valley for the needs of the great cities. All these commodities, under the influence of a highly organized system of transport and marketing, moved freely from one corner of the empire to the other. So I think that gives you a remarkable sense of what the Pax Romana had accomplished, right? And the fact that this far-flung empire that ruled over most of the known world, right, all its parts were communicating with each other, even in this basic economic sense, right, of trade being able to move. Now, this begins to break down in the 3rd century already, the 3rd century AD, as you get internal disorders from different military factions fighting. The costs of maintaining the empire, the costs of the military skyrocket, which partly to keep the military happy. That we're no longer in the age of the Republican peasant soldier, right? We're in the age of professional militaries, more loyal to their commanders than anyone else, right? And you have and so you're having a lot of civil war and infighting, and just to keep them happy. And so a result of this is hyperinflation, right, which leads to high levels of taxation, and you have a general cycle of economic ruin and collapse, which develops already in the 3rd century. Now, one of the consequences of this is the gradual breaking down of commerce within the Roman Empire, right? It is growing grain rather than transporting it, right? People are starting to localize, the economies are starting to get localized, right? In other words, let's create self-sufficient manors, right? Right, estates, right, where people can live off the sustenance of the land. And very important to this process that's going on in the 3rd and 4th centuries is de-urbanization, right? People are fleeing as the economy collapses, epidemics, cities. There's a process of depopulation that some people, including Dawson, connect with changes in the family structure, right? And other types of things. There's a process of depopulation. People are fleeing cities, moving to the countryside for greater economic security. This is an astounding, I think, an astounding statistic. So one scholar, Aldrete, estimated that around the time of Augustus, the population of Rome was about 1 million people. By the 6th century, another scholar, Hibbert, estimates it at 30,000, just to give you a sense. And many entire cities simply disappear, right? So you have depopulation. The road system gradually gets covered over with wilderness, right? I mean, there's no longer security for commerce, right? And so what you're getting is the development of what the medieval or local agrarian economics, right? The landed owning estates open themselves to laborers who may be coming to cities. In return for their labor, they're provided with protection and substance. But you basically have a local agrarian system replacing the highly urbanized Roman world gradually over time. Now, as the cities collapse, so does the Roman schools and education. As the Roman historian Marcellinus wrote in the end of the 4th century AD, the libraries are closing forever, like tombs, right? The literacy rate declines, right? So we're talking about a broad-based crumbling of the entire infrastructure that had been built up by Rome over centuries. And then by the time we get to the late 4th and 5th century, we have the great Volkerswanderung, the great migration, the first of many migrations, right? The people who had lived to the north of Rome, right, outside the Roman zone of civilization in the northern parts of Europe, lived at basically a tribal level of development, right? And then what you had basically was the Huns, who were a Central Asian tribe, are sweeping through, destroying everything in their path, and the barbarians want in. Those the Romans called the barbarians, the northern European tribes of Goths and Franks and Angles and so forth, want in the Roman Empire, and they eventually essentially break through the dike, right? And the Roman Empire, by the 5th century, is overwhelmed. Now, by the way, just to back up for one moment, there are two big events I should have mentioned on this road, and then I'll get back to the barbarian invasions. Two major events. Diocletian, the Roman emperor, at the end of the 4th century, does two things that are very famous. One is he divides the empire into a Western empire and an Eastern empire because he considers it ungovernable. And he changes really the whole constitution of the Roman Empire. It now becomes what's called a dominate, as opposed to the Augustan system. That's a long story. I won't get into it too much. But the other thing was he wanted to restore the old Roman traditions, which he felt were responsible for the decadence, and he blamed Christianity, and he led the last major persecution of the Christians in the Roman Empire, which tried to eradicate the Christian religion, which had grown to maybe 10% of the population. It had been growing steadily over the centuries. After he left power, there was a struggle for power, and Constantine, after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he supposedly, according to Eusebius, saw a vision in hoc signo vinces. For whatever reason, he had his soldiers put the symbols of the Christian religion on their shields. He wins the battle, becomes the first Christian emperor of Rome. So by the 4th century, Rome is now a Catholic empire. Important. Both those facts, I suppose, are important for the Middle Ages, because the East Roman Empire survives. It's called the Byzantine Empire. And obviously the Catholic Church is going to play a larger and larger role in the early Middle Ages. Back to the barbarian migrations, right? So basically they overwhelm the Romans, right? And so basically what you have is the Roman Empire is gradually divided up by various barbarian tribes. The Vandals, pushing through Spain, go to North Africa and take over the North African provinces. The Angles and Saxons take over Roman Britain. The Franks pour into what is now France. The Visigoths pour into Spain. And then finally, you have the Ostrogoths and other tribes who pour into Italy itself. And in the year 476, the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, taking diminutive forms of the founder and first emperor of Rome, the two, is deposed. And Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, sends the insignia of Rome to the East Roman emperor, saying, now there's one emperor again. Right? So this is how it was seen at the time. So this was the deposition of the last Roman emperor. Right, and so as you can imagine, the invasions did nothing to improve the crumbling infrastructure, right, or the level of literacy in Western Europe at the time, right? So you have a period marked by chaotic migrations, by wars, by pillage, and pillage and arson, and a general kind of collapse. Although much of the infrastructure of the Romans survived into the period of the kingdom. So I guess from there, I'll turn to Boethius and Cassiodorus, perhaps, as two of the figures who helped Western, because I think you can see from this how it was very easy to imagine Western civilization collapsing entirely from this situation. Don't you think, Miles?
Absolutely. At this point, having heard about sacking and pillaging, the audience would be for. So by all means, tell us about Boethius and Cassiodorus.
Sure. So Boethius is, I think, an interesting figure, right? So although the like I said, although the barbarians had now it was the Ostrogoths under Theodoric had taken over Italy and established a kingdom in Italy. For a while, the Roman magistracies and the Senate still survived, interestingly enough. And so Boethius came from basically a kind of patrician family, and he went through the cursus honorum that we discussed last time. I believe he became a consul. Both his sons became a consul. But he was also deeply immersed in both Christianity, in the Catholic religion, and in classical philosophy and culture, right? So he wrote texts on music and on mathematics and on Catholic theology, like his on the Trinity and stuff. But he also had a grand project, you see, because he was aware one of the features of this collapse was the loss of widespread knowledge of Greek. In the time of Cicero, an educated Roman might be expected to know some, or certainly after Cicero, right? An educated Roman might be bilingual, right? In that sense, might know both classical knowledge, but knowledge of Greek was becoming very scarce. And he was aware of this problem, and his project was to translate all the works of Plato and Aristotle into Latin. Now, unfortunately, he only got through the logical works of Aristotle. Unfortunately, because he was falsely accused of being disloyal to the king because he stuck up for some people who were also being falsely accused, and ends up in prison, right? And while in prison, he writes what I think should rank as one of the canonical classics of Western civilization, which is the Consolation of Philosophy, right? So he's writing on this question of, obviously this was a man who had enormous fortune, right? Born into basically a kind of noble family with all the honors and privileges of high office, with property, with reputation, and with learning and wisdom, right? Seemed like it couldn't be more blessed. Now he's imprisoned, loses everything, loses his reputation, is taken for a traitor, and is about to die. And so he writes this book on the Consolation of Philosophy, and you know, someone pointed out, I don't remember her name, you know, there's kind of an interesting contrast with Socrates, who seems so tranquil. Boethius is wavering in this dialogue. He's having a dialogue with philosophy who comes to him, right? And it turns into a long dialogue meditation on the mutability of fortune, on the question of mercy and providence, right? Can we believe in a good God who allows these evils to occur, right? He's being punished basically for his virtues, not for his vices, right? He's being punished for sticking up for the truth and stuff like that. So it becomes, I think, a very classic kind of meditation and one of the most widely read works throughout the whole of the Middle Ages. And his translation of the logical works becomes central to those who were the monks and so forth, who were educated, you know, throughout the period of the early Middle Ages until much later, where they get augmented by additional translations of Aristotle and so forth. So that's one figure. Now, we're talking about the basically Boethius's dates are 480 to about 524 or so, right? So he's born right after the fall of the last emperor. And then Cassiodorus, who's born at the same time, around 480, but lived much longer, and followed in many ways a similar path in public life. But in later life, there's this new idea we'll talk about in a moment of monasticism, Western monasticism, that starts to emerge. And in his estate, again, he came also from kind of a patrician background, but in his estate he builds a kind of monastic library called the Vivarium, where he wants to gather all the texts and so forth, which are extant. And the other thing is he writes a book called the Institutiones, which becomes the basis of medieval education, taking from late Roman writers, Marcianus Capella, late Roman educational writers. He develops this idea of the 7 liberal arts, which he divides into the arts and the sciences. The arts being grammar, meaning knowledge of Latin, rhetoric, and logic. And the sciences being arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These become later known as the trivium and the quadrivium. And they become sort of a core element of the medieval educational system. So we see this process of handing down, of preserving and handing down that becomes very important. I don't know if there's anything to add on that or any questions you had, Miles. I mean, I was going to turn next to monasticism, which is
that's a perfect, I think, Alex. You mentioned this text, the Institutiones, and perfect point at which to move from 2 examples in Boethius and Cassiodorus of what we often call in history the great man theory or reading, the look to pivotal leading figures who help galvanize, crystallize, and innovate. But the emergence of a new Europe out of the ruins of the Roman Empire, like any civilizational undertaking, has to be very much a story of institutions. And I think you're about to turn to some of those that help not only develop ideas, but actually propagate culture and civilization, if it's fair to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's probably nothing more essential to understanding the early Middle Ages than to understanding monasticism, because that's really the place, the Noah's Ark, as it were, where civilization goes on, really. Well, an Eastern form of monasticism emerged in the late Roman Empire, and it seemed to be in some ways so. In the early periods of Christianity, when it was often an illegal and persecuted sect, there was heroism just in being a Christian. But once the Roman Empire became a Catholic empire, right, becoming Christian became a route to preferment, right? And there was a concern among many that, let's say, the Christian ideals, the heroic Christian ideals, were being diluted by the worldliness, right? And so you had the development of people who would go off to the desert, right, and live austere and ascetical lives. To understand what monasticism is about, I thought this quote from Thomas Aquinas, because it's not necessarily an easy idea to understand for people, for people exactly what the monastic ideal is about. So I thought this quote from St. Thomas Aquinas might help us understand. So he wrote, "Since the best thing for man is to become attached in his mind to God and divine things, and since it is impossible for man intensively to busy himself with a variety of things, in order that man's mind may be applied to God with greater liberty, counsels are given in the divine law whereby men are withdrawn from the busy concerns of the present life, as far as is possible for one who is living an earthly life." And as Dawson describes, right, so you think of the monastic vows, which were poverty, chastity, and obedience. They're basically annulling the 3 most powerful impulses in the world, right, or working against the agere contra, which are the power impulse, annulled by humility and obedience, the sexual impulse, right, by chastity, and the economic impulse, which the monks took vows of poverty, renouncing the world. And the idea was to renounce the distractions of worldly life in order to live prayerfully in contemplation of the divine, right? And what's important to understand about the Middle Ages is this was sort of the universal ideal. Obviously, not everybody could be a monk, right? But the contemplative ideal was something which inspired the whole Middle Ages. Nonetheless, there were 2 very important functions which were served by monasticism. The first was the preservation of learning, right? So it was in the you could imagine in this barbarian environment, right, of non-literate tribal cultures, right, which had overtaken the Roman Empire. What the monasteries did was create a kind of inner sanctum, right, where learning and culture and scholarship could go on during this age, right? And the other thing was missionary work, right? There was the ideal that, I forgot who said it now, but right, of breaking the barbarians on the bark of Peter, which is to say, converting the barbarians to Catholicism was part of what the church really didn't have weapons, right? So at this stage to fight with, but they had the goal of converting them. And the pivotal figure in the development of Western monasticism was Saint Benedict of Nursia, right? Who lived from 480 to 543, establishes his first monastery in Monte Cassino, and he establishes a rule that can be applied everywhere, right? So people of whatever ethnic background, right? One of the problems is you have now so many different peoples wandering through Europe, right? How do you create? So you created this, let's say, world of Latin culture, the Latin classics, the Latin fathers of the church, the Latin Bible, the Latin liturgy, right? Which was in some way separated from the world outside. And one thing important that Pope Benedict, who took his name, because Benedict is sometimes, Benedict of Nursia is sometimes called the father of Europe. One thing interesting that he referenced was the motto, ora et labora, meaning prayer and work, is instructive for this notion of the new Romanitas, the new Romanity, the new Roman culture which was emerging. Why? Because in the Roman world, labor, manual labor, tended to be looked down upon, right? As being kind of lowly. But you have to remember, in the Christian religion, the Savior was a carpenter, right? So labor got a certain dignity, and it was very important for Benedict that the monks would also be laborers, right? That was part of the discipline. So I think those are two interesting ideas. And of course, the trivium and the quadrivium became central to monastic education. Of course, the apex for the monks would have been the sacra pagina, the knowledge of the Word of God, and theology, right, in the study of the Latin Church. But nonetheless, even to understand them, there was the belief that the liberal arts were an essential part of education. And this was virtually the only place, the monasteries, where literate culture went on, and gradually, over the centuries, won over the barbarian tribes quite astoundingly. So I think that's one thing important to talk about. Where I was going to go was then to talk a little bit about the papacy and Gregory the First. But did you have any thoughts or questions that you want to add before I move on?
No, I would momentum at this point.
Yeah. So in terms of the papacy, there's a lot of figures one could discuss. Probably the most important would be Pope Gregory the First in the year 590 to 605. So we have to remember. No, I guess this paper. We have to remember that the Roman Empire had fallen apart, right? When Attila the Hun came marching into Italy in the 5th century, the Roman Emperor Valentinius hightailed it out of there. But Pope Leo went out to speak with him. We don't know what was said, but for whatever reason, Attila turned back his armies, right? So that's as symbolic of an event as possible for this shift to the New Rome, right, which was the Rome of the Catholic Church taking the place of the Rome of the Empire, right? And the Leo, who had been a monk himself, right, and he was a learned writer. He is considered sort of the last, one of the last Latin doctors and fathers of the church for his writings. One of the important things that he did was emphasized the centrality of charity, right? Because you can imagine there's going to be a lot, with all the displacement, war, conflict, impoverishment, epidemics going on throughout Europe, there's going to be a lot of just human suffering, right? So he wrote, I hold the office of steward to the property of the poor, right? And he was very famous for how much, basically making all the churches emphasizing strictly, it's tried to strictly enforce it, making all the churches centers of charity, centers of the care of the poor and the sick and the weak and so forth, right? Which greatly increased the prestige of the papacy. The other thing was the impetus which he gave to the missions, right? So the story is told that they saw a fair-skinned slave in Italy. He saw a fair-skinned slave being sold, I guess, the market, being carried around in the market. And he asked, what is that? And they said, oh, it's an angle. And he said, not an angle, an angel. And he sent out Saint Augustine of Canterbury to send a mission to England to convert the Anglo-Saxons, right? Because Roman culture had been pretty well wiped out by the Roman Christianity seemed to have been pretty well wiped out by the barbarian invasions, and that's the beginning of the conversion of England to Catholicism. So Gregory the Great, I believe, is honored to this day still in the Anglican Church as well, right? As an important figure in the history of England as well. I guess I can just talk a little bit about the process of just some of the important figures in these conversions, right? So a very important one was Clovis, the Merovingian king of France, who was converted to Catholicism in the year 496. And that's why France got the title of the eldest daughter of the church. And it's a very important thing because the close alliance between the Franks and the papacy, which culminates with Charlemagne, becomes a very important theme. So this is the first, we could say, big breakthrough. I think many people know about the missions of St. Patrick in Ireland, and then St. Columba had gone to Scotland already some years before. St. Canterbury carries Catholicism to England. One of the figures I think important to mention about England, about a century after St. Augustine of Canterbury, is the Venerable Bede, who's a figure I think many people would have heard of. Again, another figure very learned in the Latin classics, in Virgil and all of these figures. He wrote texts on astronomy. He is the figure who popularized the Anno Domini calendar, the dating system we still use, right? But probably his most important text was the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, which has earned him the sobriquet of the father of English history, right? So Venerable Bede, both as a scholar and as a historian, and as just a figure in the history of England, is a very important figure. Now, what was the situation in Spain at this time? So the Visigoths, who had invaded Spain, were what were called Arian Christians. They had been converted, but not to the Catholic form of Christianity. So what you had was Arian Christians ruling over a Romanized or Roman Catholic population. Spain had been one of the most Romanized regions of the empire. And so you had the figure of the king. Recared converts to Catholicism around 586. And you have a very important figure of St. Isidore of Seville, who's also important in this whole issue of the preservation of classical learning. He writes a gigantic treatise called the Etymologiae, which is really a universal encyclopedia. And like many of these other figures, he's worried that learning will be lost. And so he tries to assemble as much classical knowledge and learning as possible into this gigantic universal encyclopedia, which again is one of the most widely read texts in the Middle Ages. So what we're having is this gradual process of conversion. I should also mention St. Boniface of England, who becomes the apostle to the German-speaking peoples, right, in the early 8th century. I guess there's the famous story of him felling the oak of Thor. And when many of the Germanic peoples didn't see thunderbolts coming out of the sky to punish them for allowing that sacrilege to happen, many of them converted to Christianity. I guess that's one of the famous stories. But anyway, he led many famous missions among the German-speaking peoples. Ultimately, he was killed by a group of Germanic pagans. But Boniface was important there. And then you have Cyril and Methodius. I should mention there's Slavic peoples coming into Europe as well. They carry Catholicism to the Slavic peoples, right? So you have this gradual process of over a few centuries of absorbing the various barbarian tribes into Catholic faith. Now, I was now going to turn to sort of the political events which culminate with Charlemagne, which probably were about, and Charlemagne and his successors are probably where we'll leave off. But did you have any thoughts, questions, comments, anything before I move on?
Now to that the greatest number in our audience will know already, which is Charlemagne. It's kind of an iconic figure, and I think it would be useful to know in this sort of turbulent but in some ways fertile or fecund period, what is it that makes him so special?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to know is that that barbarian wave of invasions I spoke about, that was only the first of a set of waves of invasions that Europe was to endure, right? And so Charlemagne is going to be the figure that tries to put a lot of things back together. But I think just to give a little context, so there's now another wave of invasions that happens in the 8th century, okay? So what you have invasions from the east of Bulgar and Slavic tribes that I just referenced, and then you have a set of Islamic invasions, which basically utterly hobble the Byzantine Empire. About 2/3 of the Christian world, perhaps, now come under the Islamic Empire. And the Arabs then cross from North Africa into Spain in the year 711, where it's conquered, and then they move north into France, right? And it's Charlemagne's ancestor, Charles Martel, who in the year 732 stops the Islamic advance into Europe. And you can imagine that in Europe's current, in the condition that I've described, it's not in great shape to resist invasion, right? But at all events, Charles Martel is the figure who stops the advance in the year 732. And Boniface is one of the figures who's trying to forge an alliance between the Franks and the papacy, who are being threatened by another tribe. So the first of Charlemagne's achievements, right? So he comes to power as head of the Carolingian dynasty of the Franks in what's now France in the year 771. So his first achievements are basically military, right? So the Lombards are threatening the Pope, and he, as the ally of the Pope, brings his army down and crushes the Lombards. Then he engages in a series of wars with the Saxons, who are pagan German tribes, a series of brutal wars, which end in often the forced baptism of the Saxons, right? So there's a series, but basically Charlemagne is taking over the region of what would be Germany and much of Central Europe, right? And he's fighting as well in Central Europe. And then there are calls for his help in Spain, which has been occupied by Islamic forces, and he sends his armies there. I think there's a famous episode in the Song of Roland, his paladin Roland, where he's killed in one of these fights with the Arabs, right? The Marca Hispanica, which gives Charlemagne also a military importance in part of the Reconquista. In the other part of Spain, in what's now Asturias and Galicia in western Spain, the Spaniards themselves had begun pushing the Islamic forces south. Now Charlemagne on the other side was sending his forces down. So at the end of this period, you have basically what is now France, the Low Countries, Germany, Northern Italy, much of Central Europe, all united under one rule, right? And so that part is basically military, right? He's basically reestablished a kind of empire under Catholic auspices, and in the year 800, he is crowned emperor in Rome, right? So from the standpoint of the people of the West, this was the restoration of the Western Roman Empire under Charlemagne. And as Christopher Dawson writes, he says, and thus in the new culture, all the elements that constituted European civilization were already represented. The political tradition of the Roman Empire, the religious tradition of the Catholic Church, the intellectual tradition of classical learning, and the national traditions of the barbarian peoples, right? So we have all the elements that go into the making of European civilization present in a political unity, right? And so we have, we could say, perhaps for the first time, the idea of Europe as one community, basically a religious community under the temporal rule of the emperor and the spiritual rule of the pope, right? So we have this kind of vision which is very central to the whole medieval worldview, and it's sometimes called regnum and sacerdotium, right? The two powers, the emperor and the pope, the spiritual and the temporal, as one community, right? So it's this idea of Latin Christendom. Now, he also undertakes many reforms, some of them in the sort of liturgical realm. He establishes one uniform rite, the Roman rite, for all the peoples within his empire, right? Prior to that, they were different local religious rites, right? So this is another unifying factor. There's a single religious rite for the entire empire. But there's a third element, so regnum, which is the secular rule, sacerdotium, the priestly rule. The third element central to medieval culture, which Charlemagne gives direct encouragement to, actually direct mandate to, is studium, meaning learning. He thought that the level of education was truly lamentable. So he establishes in Aachen a palace school gathering scholars from all over Europe. He picks as a fact as the head of the school an Englishman, an English monk, Alcuin of York, to head this up. And their task is basically to gather all the texts, to produce, standardized copies of all the great classical texts and religious texts and so forth, right? And he gives a mandate that every cathedral, that is, every see of a bishop, must have a cathedral school, right? Which is going to be based around a liberal arts education as well as theological studies, right? He publishes an Admonitio Generalis, right? He also had a reputation for a high level of justice. He sent people around, so that the empire was sort of subdivided feudally. I might talk about feudalism a little bit later. But he sent officials around to each province of his empire to take complaints from the people, right? How are they doing? Right? Are they carrying out my orders? So he took a great deal of interest. And so you kind of have the idea in Charlemagne, he's kind of like the commander of the faithful, sort of thing, right? The whole idea of, there's also a renaissance in the arts. You have the Carolingian style, illuminated manuscripts. It's shown in the churches, the architecture and sculpture of the time. It's a definite style which we could say is sort of the ancestor of many of the medieval styles of art. Under his grandson Charles the Bald, right, John Scotus Eriugena from Ireland was brought. Basically, the Carolingians were an empire that looked for talent wherever it was, who was perhaps the most significant philosopher of the period, and one of the very few European, well, not European, the Greeks are Europeans, one of the very few Latins who knew Greek at the time. So you have this period of a kind of rebirth, right? There's kind of a period of a certain amount of political stability, which is brought about by Charlemagne. You have this conception of a unified Europe. Also important, I think, to this notion of a unified Europe is that the German peoples had been outside of the Roman world largely, but now they were part of it, right? So whereas before, a place like Saxony, perhaps, right, would have been seen as outside the Roman world, now the Northern European peoples and the Latin peoples and the Celtic peoples, right, are all being brought into this sort of religiously based sort of unified culture. Now I'll just mention something briefly about feudalism and then talk about the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire. So just as I talked about manorialism, where you'd have a lord over a certain amount of land, and then, let's say, peasants who are bound to the land, right, as being the basic economic unit, feudalism, we could say, was kind of the localization of political power, right, because it was not very easy to have very strongly centralized states. So basically, and remember, much of the money economy had collapsed as well. So you basically had a system whereby the landowner would give a fief, that is a set of land, which would include the laborers on the land, to his vassals in exchange for homage, right? And within that territory, each lord, as it were, right, whether it was a duke or a count or whatever it is, was largely autonomous. So we have basically a highly decentralized, relative to what we saw with the Romans, the antique Romans, a highly decentralized form of political power, which was typical of the Middle Ages. So I think that's what I'd want to cover as far as the figure of Charlemagne. I think three important areas, right? His role as a political and military leader, his success as a political military leader, tied to this vision of a united Europe, his role as a promoter or patron of culture and learning, and his role in even just the liturgical stuff. All of these things, I think, make Charlemagne certainly a pivotal figure in history. But I would talk about next the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts or questions at this pausing point.
Maybe so much talk, a highly developed decadence and so on. There's something a bit intriguing about the figure of Charlemagne in this Carolingian period, and that is, I guess, our focus has been on classical ideas and classical tradition and things like paideia, for example. In Charlemagne, you see a figure that, up to a point, you could say does more than just restores or preserves what have been cultivated in earlier times, in Greek and Roman cultures, for example. He seems to build, seems to achieve perhaps new syntheses. So is there something for the audience that might be educational about the genius for making in this period? The figures that you've talked about who established monasticism, or Charlemagne himself, is there something that we should say about how they may have advanced on the classics, or is there a kind of universalism that they formulated that's new? Is there a genius for building in the face of chaos that we can learn from?
Well, I mean, there's sorry, I have a bit of a cough today. Well, I mean, I think what we see is the synthesis of elements, right? So Dawson had spoke about the political tradition of the Roman Empire, the religious tradition of the Catholic Church, the intellectual tradition of classical learning, and the national traditions of the barbarian peoples, right? Those four elements. In the Roman period, those things didn't really mix in any, I mean, we could say that they were not synthesized in a very effective way, right? So what you had at the late Roman Empire was the efforts of the emperors, for example, to subordinate the church and these sorts of things. But now I think what you're having is, from these disparate elements, a new kind of culture emerging, which includes all of these, right? And obviously, the Christian element comes to the fore, obviously, in the Middle Ages, because so much of the constructive work is centered around the church, right? So there's kind of a centrality to the Christian religious ideals. I talked also about, with Benedict, how there were some differences with a purely classical worldview in terms of attitude toward labor, right? For example, and I think we see also with the medieval, the bond. I mean, a very different. Whether you say it's better or worse, a very different view of government, a much more personal, right? Based upon ties of loyalty and honor between persons, right? As opposed to kind of the abstract centralized state of the old Roman Empire, which is a different conception, you know. So yeah, I mean, I think definitely this is a new synthesis. We can't call what the Middle Ages is producing simply classical civilization, right? At the same time, the preservation of classical civilization means it's not simply a new civilization either, right? I mean, there are elements from the past that are being preserved into this period, right? Does that help answer the question?
I think that's extremely helpful as we look sort of or recap at the moment of the decline of the Carolingian episode and the move to what comes next.
Yeah. So amazingly, what I've just described was not the end of the invasions. So there's two things that happen. One is that by the time of his grandchildren, the empire is broken up, right, into, we could say, proto-France and proto-Germany in some sense. I'm being a little anachronistic, but more or less it breaks up into among his grandchildren at the Treaty of Verdun in 843. But the main thing is there are new invasions from the east, from the south, and from the north. So we have the Magyars coming into Eastern Europe, who are the Hungarians, the present-day Hungarians, take over the region which is now Hungary, right, who were originally an Asiatic tribe. And then we have new Islamic advances. In the early 9th century, there's an Islamic invasion of Sicily, which gives them a launching pad for actual attacks into the Italian peninsula. In 846, the old St. Peter's Basilica is sacked by Arab raiders. But that was probably not even the worst of the invasions. The big one was the Vikings, right, who in the 9th century begin a massive set of attacks throughout Europe, right? So they start launching attacks on Ireland, which basically, and churches, you see, churches and monasteries are some of the richest things you could find in this period, right? So they become major targets, and they destroy much of what had been built up in terms of Celtic Christianity. England comes under major attack, and I'll get into that in a moment. And then you have they also came along the rivers, right, and attacked inland into the regions of France and the Low Countries and so forth, right? And so you have major battles between the Franks and the Vikings, right, that are going on. Right, so Europe is being pummeled from all directions, right? And obviously this dislocation is going to have a big effect on the culture. Now, I wanted to mention what I think is a very interesting figure of Alfred the Great of England. In some ways, a figure who was ahead of his time. So he has two regions of import. There's two reasons for why he's important. One is, although he was not able to altogether prevent the invasion of England by the Vikings, they were able to set up what was called the Danelaw, right, in England. He was able to preserve a zone of Anglo-Saxon in his kingdom of Wessex through his military prowess, able to preserve a zone of Anglo-Saxon culture, right? The other reason he's important is that he was rarest of rare scholar king, right? And interestingly, he thought that it was important to give education not just to the priests and the clergy, right, which is largely where education was focused, but also to the laity. And so he engaged in a work of translation of many of the texts we've discussed, including the Consolation of Boethius, right, the Consolation of Philosophy of Boethius, into Anglo-Saxon or Proto-English, right, so that the common people could read this. So in a way, we could say King Alfred was kind of building a kind of Carolingian renaissance on the English Isle and the British Isles, which I think is kind of interesting. So we have this new period of dislocation, and then what I'll probably talk about next week is the reestablishment of yet another synthesis from the ruins in the form of the high medieval culture. So probably a good pausing point. Did you have any final thoughts or questions or comments?
Maybe just on of integrating and converting barbarism or barbarians. In the figure you just mentioned, Alfred the Great in England, you see kind of synthesis of a lot of the classical virtues or pillars of civilization that we've looked at so far. We've talked about elements of cultural confidence, not just in ideas that have the power to illuminate and shape character and explore and clarify reality, but also to build up civilization. So we've seen what I would call maybe snippets of Athenian-style paideia. You were just talking about the translation of great works into the vernacular. We've seen Spartan agoge, in the Carolingian military vigor, Roman carryovers of institutions of law and currency, political institutions, and also that sort of Roman ethos of piety. We started off with pejoratives, right? The Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, as potentially misleading terms if we want to understand this period between modernity and the Roman era better. Certainly, if there's one term that has even more pejorative loaded on it than the Dark Ages, it would be barbarism. So is there something in these barbarian cultures that people like Charlemagne and others tapped that went into the mix that is a part of the strength of the European culture that we see emerging here?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question because, right, the Germanic contribution to Western civilization is something that historians in the early 20th century were quite interested in, but that seems to have faded somewhat recently, right? What was the specifically Germanic contribution? Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, we're talking about things that started in sort of embryo because they were relatively primitive cultures at first, right? That started in embryo but developed into things that I think people would find quite enlightened. So we have the ideas of loyalty and honor and bravery, courage, right? All these things were very much part of the Germanic ethos. Personal loyalty, right? Which then we find in the institutions of the Middle Ages were largely coming from that, right? I mean, the sense of personal loyalty that bound the different groups together. Another thing that's important is many scholars talk about the origins of representative government as coming from the Germanic war councils, right? So the proto-English Parliament developed out of Anglo-Saxon councils and this sort of thing. So those are two elements that sort of leap the mind, and of course, gradually over time, when you think of something like the Arthurian ethos of chivalry, we may not at first think about the Goths and their raiders, but it was really an evolution, right? An evolution which synthesized Germanic martial ethos with Christian concepts of concern for the poor and the weak, right? So it's about using force and power in the defense of the weak, or in the defense of the faith, or in the defense of higher ideals, right? So I think we have a gradual transfiguration of the Germanic ethos through the fructifying influence of these other elements of Christianity and classical culture. The final thing that's important to mention about the barbarians is, as Dawson describes, the peoples of Europe. Really, I think he uses the way he describes it, sort of the matter of Europe are the barbarians, right? We could say the forms in one, the Roman and the Greek culture and the influence of the Christian, but the various peoples and their customs. If you think about the English and the French and the Germans and so forth, right? So many of their particularities come from the ethnos from which they came. So that's also an important thing to reference, right? So certainly they have I think as we've seen in this discussion, have had their important share in this theme of the making of Europe, right? Sound fair?
Very much so. given people quite a bit to chew on a number of fronts. And it should be intriguing on the theme that's so much at the front of people's minds these days, which is, you know, how culture and civilization assert themselves in the face of chaos. We've probably covered enough ground for one installment easily, but I think we do invite people to stay tuned with us as we track these sort of peaks or high points or golden ages in the progress of Western civilization, and also again to look on the video for your email if they would like to join us in our most recent course, which is the comparison of Socrates and Nietzsche, kind of North Star and South Star, as it were, of cultural and philosophical paradigms.
Absolutely, and I'll also put our website on there in case anyone wants to look at what we do and check out some of our other courses, offerings, and activities. So thanks very much for joining us. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.